My grandfather came, he wasn't a wealthy man, so he had to buy the cheap land. It was about $150 an acre. And the expensive land, which is the flat land, was about $300 an acre. And that was in 1911. But when I married Ruth, we were looking at land, wanted to sort of pieces where we could sort of amalgamate the patches here and there that my grandfather and my father had done. We applied to join these up, and we did. And it cost us $3 an acre, and that was about 1967 or something like that.
My father came here in 1903, and he's, as I said, I'm second generation, my children are third generation. He worked when he was only 16 years old when he came here. And he worked mostly on farms to start with, and then he got involved in the bush, working in the bush. He was involved in the river drives on the Kootenai River in the spring and winter logging. And in 1917, they bought what we used to call the Island Ranch. But it was probably one of the best ranches in the area because it was river bottom, it was sub-irrigated, there was no irrigation to it, and it was very easy to maintain.
I think people who farm have this deep calling in them. It's not something you go into lightheartedly. It's not a job. It's not just another job. It's a complete embraces a way of life, and it's relentless, harsh, tough, very risky. And when you produce some food, you have to pay everything for it. You don't just put on the clothes and go and get a check, because you're a teller or this sort of thing. You've got to pay for every nail and piece of wood and tractor and oil and welding, and it's an enormous amount of expense to produce a cabbage.
We lived at Burton, 25 miles south of McCusp, and we had to farm there, and we worked the farm. Got a contract with the CPR to supply Minto. It would arrive in Burton at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we would get up at 3 o'clock and go and pull all the carrots and green onions and stuff and wash them and have them at the boat by 6 in the morning. And we did that twice a week, like for quite a few years. And then we shipped milk to the Gates of St. Leon, it was called, a big hotel that was built on the lake there.
I was born in McCusp, March the 30th. 1912. Well, I grew up in Burton on the farm until I was 19. Then I got married and moved to Edgewood. I did all the chores and all that kind of stuff, and I didn't have time for any other thing besides that. Because we walked 3 miles to school and then 3 miles home again. And like Dad was away working in the mines, and I looked after the cattle and did the milking and all that kind of stuff.
My family arrived at Revelstoke in 1956. My husband was a logger, and that was partly the reason that we came to Revelstoke. And when he saw this little farm, he decided he had to have it. We moved into a little shack, and soon after acquired several cattle, lots of chickens and ducks, and this was our life. My husband worked in the bush, and that's how we made our living.
My parents lived in Burton. My dad was a logger, a miner, did a lot of mining in the Slocan mostly, and my grandparents came to Burton in 1905, 1906, and more or less homesteaded in Burton. My grandfather had cherries in his orchard, and that was our first job in July, was to pick cherries, and they would be sorted. He'd take them down to the Minto on a Monday or Thursday morning, put them on the boat, and that product would be in Calgary the next day. That was basically their cash crop. It was fruit. At one time there was a cannery in Burton, and there was also a packing house there.
My first introduction to Renata was that my great-grandfather, P.P. Dick, owned a place here, and used to have a fruit farm here, and he lived in one of the older homesteads. And I came as just a child to visit my great-grandfather and grandmother here, and my folks used to help pick cherries. And what they used to do is sell their cherries to all the relatives in the prairie, in Rosemary, Alberta, and Brooks. I've got a lot of relatives, and they shipped the cherries actually all over the place. So they had cherries, and they had peaches, and varying variety of apples and pears and everything. So they managed a fair-sized orchard. And
my grandmother arrived in Quebec City on November 11th, 1919, and then came here to Robson, and the family have lived in this home since 1920. At that time, my grandfather planted orchards in the back, and all of the area in Robson, the whole valley runs due east-west, and it's a very temperate climate.
The one thing I remember mostly about the Arrow Lakes, of course, and Daisy, I'm sure, will remember that too, is that it was one of the finest areas of agricultural land in Canada, not only in British Columbia. It grew the most marvelous peaches, apricots, and cherries.
I agree with that. You know, Mr. Webster, who was there since 1909, he said that any time that their fruit came up against the Okanagan fruit, they won the prizes. Yes. Because he thought it was because they didn't have to use irrigation. It was just so natural.
And of course, the cherries, if I remember, I think they were bings. The cherries were as big as apricots, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Beautiful.